Hello. There are battles that determine the fate of kings, and there are battles that decide the fate of empires. But once in a millennium, a battle erupts that shapes the future of an entire civilization. In the year 732, a tempest swept northward, a force that had already subjugated half the known world. Kingdoms crumbled, cities were engulfed in flames, and it seemed as though nothing could halt their relentless advance. Yet, on the fringes of Europe, a solitary army stood defiant in their path, outnumbered, outmatched, yet unbroken in spirit. Their leader was not an emperor, nor a crowned monarch, but a man simply known as the Hammer. The events that unfolded next would reverberate for centuries, irrevocably shaping the destiny of an entire continent, and perhaps even the world itself. The early 8th century was an era of unstoppable momentum for the Umayyad Caliphate. In less than 100 years, Islam had spread like wildfire from the deserts of Arabia, across North Africa, into Spain, and now relentlessly pressed into the very heart of Europe. Cities fell like dominoes, and entire kingdoms collapsed before this overwhelming tide. For many, it seemed inevitable that the crescent moon would soon eclipse the cross. By 711, Muslim armies had already crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and swept through the Iberian Peninsula with breathtaking speed and efficiency. In a mere handful of years, the Visigothic kingdom of Spain was completely obliterated. The conquerors brought with them not only formidable armies, but also a new culture, a new system of administration, and a new faith. To the north, however, lay the territories of the Franks, a collection of tribes and fragmented kingdoms, struggling to find a unified identity, but nonetheless standing in the path of further expansion. At this point in history, Europe was vastly different from the continent we picture today. There was no unified France, no mighty Germany, no powerful England. Instead, scattered territories constantly fought for survival, as much against one another as against external invaders. And from among them rose a man who would soon indelibly etch his name into the annals of history, Charles Martel. The illegitimate son of a Frankish nobleman, Charles had not inherited power easily or without a struggle. Born out of wedlock, his claim to leadership was tenuous at best, and rivals constantly circled him like ravenous wolves. Yet, through a combination of cunning, shrewd political maneuvering, and undeniable military prowess, he began to forge a formidable reputation for himself. He became known as Martel, the Hammer, not because of any inherited wealth or noble birth, but because of the relentless force he displayed on the battlefield. When word reached him that a massive Umayyad force, under the command of the general Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, had crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and was laying waste to southern France, burning and pillaging as they advanced, Charles knew exactly what was at stake. This was not simply a fleeting raid for plunder. This was a full-scale invasion that had the potential to forever alter the very face of Europe. The Umayyads moved with incredible speed. They captured Bordeaux, ravaged Aquitaine, and left a trail of fear and devastation in their wake. Monasteries were looted, villages were razed to the ground, and nobles were mercilessly slaughtered. Panic spread like wildfire across the countryside. Many people began to wonder if God himself had abandoned Christendom. But Charles refused to succumb to panic. Instead, he began rallying warriors from across his realm. Frankish veterans, hardened by countless tribal wars, peasants, pressed into service, and loyal nobles who deeply believed in his cause. He did not possess the sheer numbers to match Abdul Rahman's vast host, but he possessed something far more crucial: discipline and a sound, well-thought-out strategy. By the autumn of 732, Charles had gathered his men near Tours, a city that symbolized Christian learning and unwavering faith. He meticulously chose his ground. Unlike his enemies, Charles understood that cavalry, fast, highly mobile, and devastating as it could be severely blunted if forced to fight on unfavorable terrain. He strategically positioned his army on a high, wooded hill where the Muslim horsemen would find no easy path for a direct, devastating charge. His infantry locked their shields together, firmly braced their spears, and patiently waited. The stage was now set. The fate of Europe would soon hang precariously in the balance, not in the ornate halls of kings or within the solemn prayers of monks, but on a blood-soaked battlefield where two vastly different worlds collided head-on. For several agonizing days in the autumn of 732, the two opposing armies stood locked in a tense standoff, staring each other down across the cold, windswept French countryside. The Umayyad force, numbering perhaps 40, 0 or more, stretched out across the open fields as far as the eye could see. Their banners shimmered vibrantly in the wind, and their restless cavalry, horses stamping and snorting with impatience, were eager to engage. They had swept through Iberia with relative ease and crushed every foe that had dared to stand in their path. To many of them, these Franks were simply the next group of victims, ripe for the taking. But Charles Martel's men were unlike any of the disorganized war bands that the Muslims had encountered before. They stood in tight, disciplined ranks on the high ground, shield locked to shield, the sharp tips of their spears glinting menacingly in the pale autumn sun. They were not professional soldiers in the Roman sense, nor were they the knights in shining armor that later centuries would romanticize, but they possessed one absolutely crucial advantage. Charles had meticulously drilled them to fight as a cohesive, disciplined unit. They would not break easily under pressure. The two armies camped within sight of each other, the air thick with tension. At night, the fields glowed with the light of thousands of flickering campfires. Men prayed fervently, sharpened their blades meticulously, and whispered anxiously about their families far away. Some trembled with fear, dreading the coming tide of battle. Others burned with fierce conviction, believing that this was the moment when Christendom itself was on trial. Abdurrahman, the Muslim commander, faced a difficult dilemma. He knew that his cavalry was his greatest and most devastating weapon. Light, fast, and incredibly deadly. They had shattered the Visigothic lines in Spain and routed countless enemies with ease. But Charles had chosen his ground so masterfully that the terrain offered little opportunity for a truly devastating charge. To recklessly throw his horsemen headlong into the Frankish shield wall could very well spell disaster. So, for days, Abdurrahman hesitated, probing for weaknesses and waiting for Charles to descend into the plains below, where his cavalry could truly dominate the battlefield. Charles, however, steadfastly refused to move. He knew that patience was his greatest ally in this situation. Each day that passed allowed more of his reinforcements to trickle in, steadily swelling his numbers and bolstering his strength. He built his confidence not on flashy maneuvers or bold gambits, but on the quiet, unwavering courage of men who understood, deep in their hearts, that they were fighting for their homes, their faith, and their very survival. This tense standoff could not possibly last forever. Tension mounted with each passing dawn, becoming almost palpable. Scouts from both sides clashed in small skirmishes on the edges of the battlefield, testing each other's strength. Rumors began to spread that the Umayyads were planning to march north towards Tours itself, with the intention of sacking the holy city and irreparably breaking the morale of all of Christendom. Charles simply could not allow this to happen. Finally, Abdurrahman made his decision. He could not afford to wait indefinitely. His men were growing increasingly restless, and their supplies were beginning to dwindle. He ordered his cavalry forward, preparing to unleash the thunderous power that had carried Islam across continents. As the sun rose on that fateful morning, the air was filled with the ominous sound of thousands of hooves pounding the earth. Lines of heavily armored riders formed, their banners snapping crisply above them, their curved swords catching the sunlight and reflecting it in blinding flashes. They shouted praises to God, supremely confident that victory was not only likely, but inevitable. On the hill, the Franks tightened their formation, bracing themselves for the onslaught. Shields overlapped, spears angled forward like the impenetrable quills of a hedgehog. Behind them, Charles Martel rode along the line, his voice booming over the din. Filled with resolve, "Hold your ground," he commanded. "Do not break ranks. Stand firm, for today, we fight not just for ourselves, but for all of Europe." The moment had finally arrived. The clash of civilizations was about to erupt in all its fury, and the fate of the continent would be decided not by kings or diplomats engaging in careful negotiations, but by the raw courage of men in steel and leather standing shoulder to shoulder against the coming storm. The silence before the storm was deafening, but it did not last long. As the Muslim cavalry surged forward, the ground trembled beneath their thunderous charge. Thousands of hooves pounded the earth in a rhythmic cadence, a sound like thunder rolling across the plains. Dust rose in great billowing clouds, partially obscuring the approaching force. Banners snapped in the wind, adding to the chaotic spectacle, and the air filled with the deafening roar of men shouting, their voices carrying on the crisp autumn air. From a distance, it must have seemed completely unstoppable. Wave after wave of armoured riders driving straight at the seemingly unyielding Frankish line. Swords flashed, lances levelled, and the sheer momentum of the charge promised to crush anything foolish enough to stand in its path. This was the same terrifying weapon that had carried Islam from Arabia to Spain, sweeping aside entire kingdoms as though they were nothing more than sandcastles. But on the hill, Charles Martel's men held their ground. They tightened their formation even further, shields pressed so close together that not a single crack showed between them. Spears bristled outward, forming a living, breathing wall of wood and iron. The Frankish infantry had no horses and no mobility to speak of, but they possessed something far more valuable, an unwavering determination to stand or die where they fought, to not yield an inch. The initial collision was earth-shattering. The Umayyad riders smashed into the Frankish shield wall with brutal, unrelenting force. The sound of iron clashing against wood echoed across the battlefield like cannon fire. Horses reared and screamed in agony as they impaled themselves on the dense forest of spears. Riders swung their curved swords downward, hacking at helmets and shoulders, but the sturdy Frankish shields effectively absorbed the majority of the blows. For a fleeting moment, the line buckled slightly under the immense pressure. Men staggered, some fell, and shields splintered under the relentless assault. But Charles had drilled his warriors exceptionally well. Gaps closed quickly, and fallen shields were immediately replaced by the men behind them. The line bent, but it did not break. Frustrated, the Muslim cavalry pulled back and charged again, hoping to finally smash through the seemingly impenetrable wall through sheer weight of numbers. Again, the shield wall resolutely held. Each time the riders advanced, they were met with the same unyielding wall of spears and unwavering determination. What should have been a swift rout quickly degenerated into a grinding, brutal struggle of attrition. As horsemen fell, their bodies became entangled in the spears, and their mounts collapsed in agony, adding to the growing chaos. The battlefield rapidly descended into utter chaos. The agonizing screams of men and animals mingled with the metallic clang of weapons striking each other. Dust choked the air, making it difficult to breathe. Frankish infantry, though battered and exhausted, began to push back with short swords and axes, striking at the fallen riders who had been thrown into their ranks. Blood ran freely down the slope, soaking into the colourful autumn leaves that carpeted the ground. Charles Martel himself rode tirelessly behind the lines, shouting encouragement to his weary men. He reminded them that every moment they held their ground meant salvation for their families, their homes, and their faith. "Stand firm," he cried again and again, his voice carrying like the hammer that was his namesake, pounding courage into hearts that might otherwise have faltered. Still, the Umayyads stubbornly refused to retreat. Abdul Rahman hurled wave after wave of cavalry against the hill, each time fully expecting the Franks to finally collapse. Each time the seemingly unbreakable shield wall absorbed the shock. Hours passed in this brutal, repetitive rhythm: charge, clash, withdraw, and charge again. By midday, the field was littered with corpses. Dead horses sprawled across the blood-soaked grass, their riders crushed beneath them. The Frankish ranks were bloodied, exhausted, and severely depleted. But they remained unbroken. What had begun as a supremely confident assault by the Umayyads was slowly but surely transforming into a grueling test of endurance that neither side had anticipated. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the tide of battle began to subtly shift in a way that Abdul Rahman had not foreseen. By late afternoon, the battle had devolved into a grinding stalemate. The Muslim cavalry continued their furious charges, but the Frankish shield wall stood firm, like an unyielding cliff against the relentless tide. Both armies were utterly exhausted, bloodied, and gasping for breath. The cold autumn air reeked of sweat, steel, and death. It was then that fate intervened, not with the dramatic swing of a sword, but with a simple, insidious rumor. Somewhere on the edge of the battlefield, word began to spread among the Umayyad ranks that their camp, located far behind the lines, was under attack. The baggage train, laden with loot and vital supplies, was said to be in imminent danger. For soldiers who had marched across continents, enduring countless hardships, that treasure was more than just spoils of war. It was their hard-earned reward, their wealth, their future. Panic began to ripple through the cavalry ranks. Some riders broke away from the main force, turning their horses sharply toward the rear, desperate to protect their share of the spoils. Others hesitated, torn between their loyalty to their commander and the powerful instinct to protect what was rightfully theirs. In the midst of the chaos of battle, even whispers could quickly become a flood, and soon, the iron discipline of the Umayyad host began to unravel at an alarming rate. Charles Martel immediately recognized what was happening. From his vantage point on the hill, he noticed the subtle hesitation, the growing disorder creeping into the enemy lines. His hammer was not only forged in steel, but also in impeccable timing, and he chose this moment to strike decisively. He ordered his men to press forward, spears and axes driving into the widening gaps left by the wavering cavalry. The Frankish infantry, utterly exhausted though they were, surged forward with newfound energy, fueled by a surge of adrenaline. They had held all day against wave after wave of attacks, and now, at long last, they sensed that the enemy was faltering. Shouts of triumph rose above the deafening clash of steel as the Franks launched a fierce counterattack, driving their foes down the blood-soaked slope in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Abdul Rahman desperately tried to regain control of the situation. He rode among his men, urging them to hold fast, to remember their faith, to stand strong against the Franks. His presence was commanding, and his voice carried clearly over the din of battle. But the tide was irrevocably shifting against him. More and more of his soldiers turned back toward the camp, leaving the front line dangerously exposed and vulnerable. What had begun as a supremely confident assault was rapidly dissolving into utter confusion and disarray. The Umayyads, for the first time in a long time, faced the terrifying possibility that this small Frankish force might not only survive, but actually triumph against all odds. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows across the battlefield. The dust, the blood, and the agonizing cries of the wounded filled the air, creating a scene of unimaginable horror. And somewhere in the midst of the chaos, destiny prepared to deliver its final, decisive blow. As the sun sank lower, painting the battlefield in a fiery, blood-red glow, the pressure on the Umayyad army grew unbearable. Their charges no longer carried the same devastating weight as before. Their formations frayed as more and more men peeled away, anxiously concerned about the troubling rumors of their plundered camp. And amid this growing chaos and uncertainty, disaster struck with devastating force. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the esteemed commander who had so confidently led his men across mountains and rivers, through victory after victory, now rode desperately among his faltering soldiers, his curved sword gleaming as he tried desperately to rally them. He shouted above the relentless clash of steel, urging them to remember God, to remember their sacred mission, and to stand fast against the Franks. But leadership alone could not stem the overwhelming tide of events. In the frenzy of combat, Abdul Rahman became a prime target. Accounts differ on the exact details of how it happened, whether he was cut down by a Frankish axe, pierced by a spear, or struck down in the chaotic crush of retreat. But what is absolutely certain is this: Abdul Rahman fell. News of his death spread through the Umayyad ranks like wildfire, igniting a wave of despair. For the already demoralized Umayyad cavalry, it was as though the very spine of their army had been broken. Their commander, the man who had guided them this far, was gone, leaving them leaderless and vulnerable. Confusion quickly turned into despair, and despair turned into a full-blown rout. The Frankish soldiers sensed it immediately. With a triumphant roar, they pressed their newfound advantage, hacking and driving the remaining Muslims from the field What had begun as a desperate defense now surged into a relentless pursuit. The hillside was littered with broken shields, shattered weapons, and the lifeless bodies of men and horses alike. For the Umayyads, there was simply no possibility of recovery without their leader and without any semblance of order. Their once great host began to melt away into the gathering darkness. The once mighty army that had swept across Spain with such devastating force now dissolved before the stubborn, unyielding resistance of the Franks. Charles Martel, though utterly exhausted, did not allow triumph to make him reckless. He skillfully kept his men together, ensuring that discipline remained paramount, even in victory. He knew that battles could be lost just as easily in the pursuit as they were won in the defense. Instead of chasing blindly after the fleeing enemy, he kept his army tight, claiming the field and securing the ground where so many men had bled and died. When night finally fell, a profound silence returned to the valley, broken only by the mournful cries of the wounded and the dying. The fires of the Umayyad camp flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows, but the army that had once threatened to carry Islam deep into the heart of Europe was no more. Abdurrahman lay dead among the fallen, and his scattered soldiers were fleeing in all directions. The Franks had not only survived against all odds, but they had also triumphed, holding the line and breaking the seemingly unstoppable advance of an empire. The Battle of Tours was definitively won, but its true significance was only just beginning to take shape in the minds of those who had witnessed it. For in the centuries to come, this single, pivotal clash would be remembered not just as a hard-fought victory, but as the turning point where Europe's destiny shifted forever. When dawn broke the next morning, the battlefield lay silent and still. The Frankish dead were mourned with heartfelt grief, but the field itself was undeniably theirs. The Umayyads, once feared as unstoppable, had vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but scattered remnants. What remained was not only the wreckage of war, shattered weapons, broken shields, and the lifeless bodies of men and horses, but also the profound sense that something truly monumental had taken place on that hallowed ground. Charles Martel did not pursue the fleeing Umayyads recklessly. Instead, he secured his hard-won ground, gathered his weary men, and firmly held the field as undeniable proof of their hard-fought victory. The body of Abdurrahman was discovered among the fallen, and with his death, the Umayyad advance into Europe effectively came to an abrupt end. They would never again push so far north with such ambition. The Battle of Tours marked the high watermark of Muslim expansion into Western Europe, the point beyond which they could not advance. For the Franks and for Christendom as a whole, it was nothing less than a watershed moment, a true turning point in history. Historians would later endlessly debate the true scale of the threat posed by the Umayyads, about whether they genuinely sought to conquer all of Europe or merely plunder its vast wealth. But for those who lived through it, for those who had fought and bled on that fateful hillside, there was absolutely no doubt in their minds that they had saved their world from utter destruction. Charles Martel's decisive victory earned him far more than mere fame. It firmly cemented his authority over the Franks and laid the essential foundation for the rise of the powerful Carolingian dynasty. From his lineage would come Charlemagne, the man who would later be crowned Emperor of the Romans, and who would go on to shape the very fabric of medieval Europe. Without the victory at Tours, that story might never have been written. The battle also quickly became the stuff of legend. Medieval chroniclers described it in epic terms as the monumental clash that saved Christendom, where a mighty hammer struck down the crescent moon and miraculously preserved the sacred cross. Whether embellished or not, the underlying symbolism has certainly endured the test of time. To this day, Tours is remembered not only as a significant military triumph, but also as a staunch defense of identity, culture, and the fragile future of an entire continent. Looking back across the centuries, the Battle of Tours was far more than just a simple fight between two armies. It was a cataclysmic collision of vastly different worlds, of deeply held faiths, and of irrevocably intertwined destinies. In the brutal clash of steel and the agonizing cries of men, Europe's path was fundamentally altered, and as the centuries rolled on, that pivotal autumn day in 732 would forever echo as one of history's most decisive hours, when a small army of Franks, led by a man known simply as the Hammer, stood defiantly against the storm and miraculously turned it aside.